In the spring of 1943, British tank crews in Tunisia began filing reports about a German tank they had not encountered before. The reports were careful and specific, the kind of documentation that men produce when they are trying to explain something that has surprised them professionally. The tank was larger than the Panzer IV. Its armor was sloped in a way that made it look like nothing in the German inventory that British crews had previously fought. Its gun was long, noticeably disproportionately long, and it fired from distances at which the standard Sherman 75mm gun could not effectively respond. The tank was the Panther. British Army intelligence had known the Panther existed. What the spring 1943 reports made clear was what the Panther meant in practical terms for the men who would have to fight it. The Sherman 75mm gun, the weapon that equipped the majority of British and Commonwealth armored units, could not penetrate the Panther's frontal armor at combat ranges. The Panther's gun could penetrate the Sherman's armor at ranges that exceeded anything the Sherman could reply to effectively. This was not a marginal disadvantage, it was a categorical one. The 75mm gun had been adequate for the tanks it had been designed to fight, the Panzer III and the earlier Panzer IV variants that had constituted the bulk of German armor in North Africa. Against those tanks, at the ranges where Normandy and the Western Desert required engagement, it worked. Against the Panther, it did not work, and no adjustment of tactics or ammunition could change the physics of what the gun could and could not do at a given range against a given thickness of sloped steel. British tank crews understood this with the specific clarity of people who had been on the wrong side of the equation. The reports went up the chain of command. They joined a growing body of documentation from Italy, from North Africa, from the intelligence assessments that were beginning to paint a picture of what the German armored force would look like in France in 1944, that described the same problem from different angles. The Sherman was the tank the British Army had. The Sherman's gun was not adequate for the tank the German Army was fielding in increasing numbers. The gap between those two facts was the problem that needed solving. In 1943, the British Army had several candidate solutions in development. The Challenger, a cruiser tank designed from the outset to carry the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, was in production. The Cromwell, a faster and more agile cruiser, was nearly ready. Both were expected to address the firepower problem that the Sherman's 75mm gun could not. Both were experiencing delays. The Challenger's suspension was problematic. The Cromwell's turret ring was too narrow to accommodate the high-velocity 75mm gun that had been planned for it, forcing a compromise that left it armed with a weapon of lower performance than intended. Neither vehicle was going to be available in the numbers required for the Normandy landings, and the timeline for those landings was not adjustable. The men who understood what this meant were the 144 tank crew members who, in 1943, submitted a formal request to the British War Office. The request was straightforward. They wanted the 17-pounder, the gun that had proven itself against Panther and Tiger armor in its towed anti-tank configuration, mounted in a Sherman turret. They wanted the gun that could do the job placed in the tank that was available. They did not care about the engineering difficulties. They cared about surviving the engagement that was coming in France. The War Office had already considered and rejected this idea. The rejection had been made for reasons that were not unreasonable. The 17-pounder was a large gun with a large breech and large ammunition, and the Sherman turret had not been designed to contain any of these things. The engineers who had looked at the problem had concluded that it could not be done without modifications so extensive they would amount to building a new turret. The engineers who had rejected it had not met W.G.K. Kilbourn. The 17-pounder had entered British service in 1942 as a towed anti-tank gun, and it had done what it was designed to do. In its towed configuration, a long-barreled weapon on a two-wheeled carriage, pulled by a vehicle and emplaced by its crew before firing, it could penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger I at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Against the Panther, whose sloped armor was more resistant than the Tiger's vertical plate, the 17-pounder, using standard armor-piercing ammunition, required closer range, but it remained effective where the Sherman's 75mm gun was not. When APDS, armor-piercing discarding sabot, ammunition became available, the 17-pounder's performance improved further. The gun worked. The problem was getting it onto something that moved. The towed anti-tank gun had a specific tactical limitation that tank crews had understood since the beginning of motorized warfare. It could not follow an armored advance. A towed gun required time to emplace, time to displace, and a crew exposed to small arms fire during both operations. In the fluid fighting that the Normandy campaign would require, attacking, exploiting, pursuing, a weapon that had to stop and set up before it could fire was a weapon that would often arrive too late or not at all. The 17-pounder needed to be on a vehicle that could keep up with the tanks. Several vehicles were trying to carry it. The Achilles, an American M10 tank destroyer modified to carry the 17-pounder, was in service. The Archer, mounted on a Valentine tank hull with the gun pointing rearward in a fixed superstructure, was an improvised solution that its crews found awkward but effective. The Challenger, the purpose-built cruiser, was coming. None of them were available in sufficient numbers. The Sherman was available in sufficient numbers. The British Army had thousands of them. The supply chain for their parts and ammunition was established and functioning, and the mechanics who maintained them were trained and equipped. If the 17-pounder could go into a Sherman turret, the problem would be solved using infrastructure that already existed, rather than infrastructure that would have to be built. W.G.K. Kilbourn was a Vickers engineer attached to the Directorate of Tank Design. He was not the first person to look at the problem of fitting the 17-pounder into the Sherman turret, but he was the first to find a solution that the others had missed. The solution was to mount the gun on its side. The 17-pounder's breech, the mechanism at the rear of the gun that opened to accept a round and closed to fire it, was the primary obstacle. In its standard orientation, the breech swung downward when opened, requiring a space beneath the gun that the Sherman turret's floor did not provide. By rotating the entire gun 90 degrees and mounting it on its side, the breech swung to the left when opened rather than downward. This changed the geometry of the problem entirely. The turret floor was no longer the constraint. The turret's left interior wall became the constraint instead, and that wall had enough room. The modification required removing the co-driver's position from the hull, his seat, his controls, his forward-facing machine gun, and converting that space into ammunition storage for the 17-pounder's larger rounds. The crew dropped from 5 to 4. The hull machine gun was plated over. The turret bustle at the rear was extended to accommodate the radio equipment that had previously shared space with a breech that was now considerably larger. These were significant changes. They were not the fundamental restructuring that the earlier engineers had concluded would be necessary. Kilbourn's pilot conversion was completed in November 1943. It was tested in February 1944. The results confirmed that the gun worked, that the turret could accommodate it, and that the Sherman's chassis, its engine, its transmission, its suspension, could carry the additional weight without significant degradation of mobility. Winston Churchill declared the Firefly the highest priority in British tank production. By May 31, 1944, 6 days before D-Day, 342 Sherman Fireflies had been delivered to the 21st Army Group. It was not enough. It was what was available. And it was, as the tank crews who had submitted their 1943 request had understood before the engineers, exactly what was needed. The men who received the first Fireflies in the spring of 1944 were not immediately certain what they had been given. The tank looked like a Sherman. It moved like a Sherman. Its engine, the Chrysler A57 multibank in the most common variant, sounded like a Sherman and required the same maintenance that Sherman crews had been performing for 2 years. The hull was the same. The tracks were the same. The running gear was the same. A mechanic who had spent his war keeping Shermans running could look at a Firefly and identify every component below the turret ring without consulting a manual. Above the turret ring, something was different. The gun was the first thing anyone noticed. The 17-pounder's barrel extended forward of the hull by a distance that made the standard Sherman 75mm gun look short by comparison, which it was. The barrel was long enough that drivers had to account for it when maneuvering through the narrow lanes and farm tracks of the Norman bocage. long enough that traversing the turret near a wall or hedgerow required a calculation that Sherman crews had never needed to make. It was, in the words of one British crew member, unmistakably a serious weapon. It looked like what it was, a gun designed to kill things at distances and through armor that the previous gun could not reach. The second thing crews noticed was the absence of the co-driver. The standard Sherman had a crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and co-driver. The co-driver sat in the right front of the hull, operated a forward-facing machine gun, and assisted the driver in certain situations. His position also served, in a tank that had been hit and was burning, as a second escape route. 2 men could exit through the hull simultaneously, rather than one at a time through the turret hatches. In the Firefly, that position was gone. The co-driver's seat had been removed, his machine gun had been removed, and the port in the hull armor through which it had fired was plated over with welded steel. The space where he had sat was now filled with ammunition, the 17-pounders rounds, which were larger and heavier than the 75mm shells they replaced, required storage that the original turret and hull had not provided for. The Firefly carried 77 rounds for its main gun. Finding room for them had required using every available cubic inch of space that the co-driver's elimination created. The crew was 4 men. In an emergency, 4 men had to exit through the turret hatches. Crews noted this without enthusiasm. The Sherman had not been renowned for ease of escape when burning. German crews had given it a nickname that its Allied operators preferred not to repeat, and removing one of the 2 hull exit points made the calculation worse. The Firefly's crews understood that they were trading a measure of survivability for the gun, and they had not been asked whether they considered the trade worthwhile. Most of them, in the summer of 1944, concluded that it was. Not because the trade was comfortable, it was not, but because the alternative was facing Panthers and Tigers with a gun that could not penetrate their frontal armor, which was a survivability problem of a different and more immediate kind. The co-driver's hatch led to a bad outcome in a specific scenario: the tank hit and burning. The 75mm gun led to a bad outcome in a different and more likely scenario: the tank facing a Panther at the ranges where the bocage required engagement. The Firefly at least gave the crew a chance to fire first. The loader's job had also changed. The 17-pounder's ammunition was larger than the 75mm rounds, longer, heavier, more awkward in the confined space of the turret. Loading required a physical effort that the 75mm had not demanded, and maintaining a sustained rate of fire meant working at a pace that tired a loader quickly. In the standard Sherman, the loader had been positioned with enough room to work efficiently. In the Firefly, with the gun mounted on its side and the breech opening to the left, the loader worked in a space that Kilbourn's modifications had made functional, but not comfortable. Functional but not comfortable described the Firefly accurately across most of its characteristics. The 17-pounder's muzzle blast was something that no written description fully prepared a crew for. The standard Sherman 75mm gun produced a flash and report that crews had adapted to over months of training and combat. The 17-pounder produced something categorically different. The muzzle blast was large enough that the gunner and commander, if they kept their eyes open at the moment of firing, would be blinded by the flash for long enough to miss whether the round had hit. Both men had to blink, deliberately, at the exact moment of firing, and then immediately reopen their eyes to observe the shot's effect. This was a skill. It had to be practiced. In training, it seemed almost absurd, grown men learning to blink on command. In combat, failing to do it meant not knowing whether you had hit the target, and not knowing meant not knowing whether to fire again or move. The muzzle blast had a second consequence that crews discovered in Normandy's bocage. The Norman countryside was defined by its hedgerows, dense banks of earth and vegetation, centuries old, lining every field and track in a pattern that turned the landscape into a maze of enclosures. Tanks moving through the bocage were frequently positioned with their guns pointing toward hedgerows at close range. When a Firefly fired in these conditions, the muzzle blast ignited whatever vegetation was in front of the barrel. After 1 or 2 shots, the hedge was burning. A burning hedge revealed the tank's position with more certainty than almost anything else that could happen on a battlefield. Smoke rose. Fire spread. Every German observer within visual range knew exactly where the Firefly was. The crew then had a choice: move immediately or accept that the next German round was already being aimed at the smoke. Moving was the correct answer. Firefly crews in Normandy learned to fire and relocate as a matter of tactical survival, not because the doctrine told them to, but because the crews who had not done it had provided the evidence that made the lesson clear. The Firefly's gun was powerful enough that German armor crews had been specifically instructed to identify and engage Fireflies before engaging standard Shermans. A stationary Firefly that had just fired, with a burning hedge marking its position, was a target that a German tank commander would prioritize. The long barrel was the other identification problem. From a distance, a Sherman Firefly's 17-pounder barrel was visibly longer than the 75mm barrel of a standard Sherman. German crews and anti-tank gunners learned to recognize the silhouette. By the summer of 1944, British Firefly crews had begun painting the rear half of their barrels in a disruptive pattern, typically two-tone, breaking the barrel's outline against the background. Designed to make the 17-pounder look shorter than it was when viewed at a distance. The camouflage worked imperfectly. An experienced German observer at close range could still identify a Firefly. But at the engagement distances where the bocage frequently placed opposing armor, imperfect camouflage was better than no camouflage, and the painted barrels became standard practice across British and Commonwealth units by late summer. The HE problem was the limitation that neither camouflage nor crew skill could address. The 17-pounder had been designed as an anti-tank weapon. Its ammunition was optimized for penetrating armor, high velocity, dense, carrying its energy in a concentrated point. Against soft targets, infantry in the open, buildings, lightly armored vehicles, the countless non-tank threats that a tank encountered in a campaign, a high-velocity, armor-piercing round was the wrong tool. It passed through soft targets without producing the fragmentation and blast that made the 75mm high-explosive rounds effective. British tank units did not replace their standard Shermans with Fireflies. They could not. A unit equipped entirely with Fireflies would have been formidable against German armor and nearly useless against everything else. The war in Normandy required tanks that could do both. The solution was not a better gun. The solution was a different organization, one that placed Fireflies and standard Shermans together in a ratio that gave each troop the firepower to kill Panthers and the flexibility to do everything else. That organization was what the next weeks of fighting in Normandy would teach the British Armored Corps to build. The 21st Army Group landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, with 342 Fireflies distributed across its armored units. The distribution was 1 Firefly per troop, 1 tank in 4. In a standard British armored troop of 4 Shermans, 3 carried the 75mm gun and 1 carried the 17-pounder. The ratio had been set by availability rather than doctrine. There were not enough Fireflies to issue more, and the units that needed them were already at the front. A Firefly for every troop was what the production numbers allowed. It was, in the circumstances, enough to change what British armor could do. In the first days after the landing, the Firefly's value was theoretical. The fighting in the immediate beachhead was close, confused, and dominated by infantry actions in which tanks were supporting rather than leading. The engagements that defined the Firefly's role, long-range tank versus tank combat, where the 17-pounder's reach and penetration were decisive, had not yet materialized in their full form. Then the German armored counterattacks began. The German response to the Allied landings concentrated its armor on the British and Canadian sectors, around Caen, where the terrain was more open and where the strategic importance of the city made it the natural axis of both Allied advance and German defense. By mid-June, British armored units around Caen were engaging Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger formations in the kind of fighting that the Firefly had been designed for. The results confirmed what the 144 crew members had requested in 1943. At ranges of 800 to 1,200 yards, the engagement distances that Normandy's terrain frequently imposed, the Firefly's 17-pounder could penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther. The standard Sherman 75mm gun could not. This single fact reorganized every tactical calculation that British tank commanders made when they saw a Panther at the end of a Norman lane or across a field of summer wheat. With a standard Sherman, the calculation was, find the flank or the rear, get close, hope. The front of a Panther at 800 yards was not an engagement a 75mm Sherman could survive reliably. The 75mm round would strike the sloped frontal armor and deflect or shatter without penetrating. The Panther's return shot would not have this problem. With a Firefly in the troop, the calculation changed. The 17-pounder could take the frontal shot. The engagement that had required a near-suicidal flanking maneuver for a 75mm Sherman could be conducted from a hull-down position at range by a Firefly. The tactical options available to a troop commander with one Firefly were materially different from the options available to a troop commander without one. German tank crews noticed immediately. The Panther and Tiger crews operating around Caen had learned to read the silhouettes of Allied tanks with the same professional attention that Allied crews were applying to German vehicles. The Firefly's longer barrel was identifiable at the ranges where Normandy fighting occurred. German commanders began instructing their crews with a priority that was unusual in its specificity. Kill the long-barrel Sherman first. The logic was sound. A standard Sherman at 800 yards was a threat that German armor could manage. Its gun could not penetrate frontal armor at that range, so an engagement on German terms, in a hull-down position, was survivable. A Firefly at 800 yards was a different problem. It could kill a Panther from the front at that range. It therefore had to die before it fired. British Firefly crews received this attention as a form of professional acknowledgement they would have preferred not to receive. The distinctive barrel that made the Firefly valuable also made it a marked vehicle. Crews that had not yet adopted the camouflage paint scheme learned to do so quickly. Crews that had adopted it found that the camouflage reduced but did not eliminate the identification problem. An experienced German gunner at close range could still tell a Firefly from a standard Sherman by its proportions and silhouette, painted barrel or not. The Firefly was both the most important tank in the troop and the most endangered. The shortage of Fireflies produced a specific anxiety in the units that had them. Major General Roberts, commanding the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, wrote letters to headquarters demanding additional Fireflies with a persistence that his superiors understood but could not satisfy. Each Firefly that existed was needed at the front. Frontline commanders, his superiors told him, would rather receive untrained crews than surrender a single tank. The training units that were supposed to receive Fireflies for crew preparation were going without. By mid-July 1944, one training group that had been allocated 15 Fireflies had received none and was using obsolete ram tanks as substitutes. The scarcity shaped how crews treated the vehicles they had. A Firefly was not expendable in the way that a standard Sherman, in the brutal mathematics of Normandy, was almost expendable. Standard Shermans were being lost and replaced at rates that the Allied supply chain could sustain. Fireflies were being lost at rates the supply chain was struggling to match. A troop that lost its Firefly to a German anti-tank gun or a Panther's first shot was a troop that had lost its ability to engage German heavy armor frontally, and might remain in that condition for days while a replacement was located and delivered. The practical consequence was that Firefly commanders were under pressure that their counterparts in standard Shermans were not. They were expected to survive, not just in the personal sense that every soldier hoped to survive, but in the institutional sense that the vehicle and its gun were a resource that the unit could not easily replace. A Firefly commander who exposed his tank to unnecessary risk, who took a position where German anti-tank guns could engage him before he could engage them, who remained stationary after firing when German observers had certainly marked his position, was not merely risking himself. He was risking something that the Army was having difficulty producing in sufficient numbers. This pressure expressed itself in the tactics that Firefly crews developed through the summer of 1944. The standard practice became what crews called supporting fire. The Firefly positioned in a hull-down position at the rear or flank of the troop's advance, covering the movement of the three standard Shermans rather than leading it. The 75mm Shermans moved forward, probed the hedgerows, drew fire, and forced German positions to reveal themselves. The Firefly waited, watched, and engaged when a German tank appeared, from a position that the German tank had not yet located, at ranges where the 17-pounder's superiority over the Panther's gun was most pronounced. The system worked because it matched each element of the troop to what it did best. The standard Sherman's 75mm gun and its HE rounds were effective against the infantry, machine gun positions, and lightly armored vehicles that made up the majority of targets in Normandy's close country. The Sherman was expendable enough, in the cold calculus of available replacements, to absorb the risks of forward movement. The Firefly's 17-pounder was the answer to the specific problem that the standard Sherman could not solve: the German heavy tank that appeared at the end of a lane or crest of a ridge and could not be engaged frontally with a 75mm gun. Ken Tout, who served as gunner and later commander in the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, described the feeling of having a Firefly in the troop in terms that went beyond tactics. The presence of the long-barreled tank, he wrote, changed what was psychologically possible for the crews around it. Before the Firefly, encountering a Panther at standard Normandy engagement ranges produced a specific kind of dread: the knowledge that the available weapons were not adequate for the threat. After the Firefly, that encounter was still dangerous, still potentially fatal, but it was no longer a situation without a solution. The Firefly did not make Normandy safe for British tank crews. Nothing made Normandy safe for British tank crews. But it made the encounter with a Panther something other than a sentence. It gave the troop a chance. The tactic did not arrive in a manual. It arrived in the field, assembled from the specific experience of men who had learned what worked by observing what had not. By July 1944, British and Canadian armored units around Caen had developed a consistent pattern in how they employed the Firefly within the four-tank troop. The pattern had not been issued from above as doctrine. It had emerged from below, from troop commanders and squadron leaders who were solving the same problem independently and arriving at the same solution. Because the problem had a logic that pointed toward one answer once you had seen enough of the alternatives fail. The problem was this: the Firefly was the most valuable tank in the troop and the most recognizable target in the troop. The Germans shot at it first. A Firefly that advanced with the troop, visible and identifiable, often died before it could use the gun that justified its existence. A Firefly that stayed back, hidden, and fired only when a German tank had already committed to engaging the other three Shermans, survived long enough to be decisive. The tactic became a choreography. The three standard Shermans moved first. They advanced along the lane, across the field, toward the tree line or the ridge or the farm buildings where German positions might be. Their 75mm guns were loaded with HE, the round that was useful against the infantry, the machine gun positions, the anti-tank teams with Panzerfausts that were the most common threat in Normandy's close country. They drew fire. They forced German defenders to reveal themselves. They were, in the brutal vocabulary of armored warfare, bait, not in the sense that their commanders considered them sacrificial, but in the sense that their movement created the conditions under which the Firefly could act. The Firefly waited. It was positioned hull down, the hull below the crest of a ridge or bank, the turret just visible, the gun able to traverse across the front of the advance without exposing the vulnerable hull sides. The commander watched through his periscope. The gunner tracked the ground ahead. The loader kept a round in the gun and another ready to follow. When a German tank appeared, when a Panther emerged from the tree line or a Tiger crest the ridge, the Firefly fired. The engagement was brief. The 17-pounder round traveled at high velocity and reached the target before the German tank commander, whose attention had been on the advancing standard Shermans, had fully registered that a fourth tank was present. If the round penetrated, and against a Panther at 800 yards it usually did, the engagement was over before it had properly begun. If it did not penetrate on the first shot, the Firefly fired again and then moved. The muzzle blast and the burning hedge had already marked the position, and remaining stationary was an invitation to the return shot that was certainly coming. The standard Shermans, meanwhile, continued their advance or took whatever cover was available. Their role in the engagement was not to fight the Panther. Their 75mm guns were not the tool for that job, and troop commanders had largely stopped pretending otherwise after enough evidence had accumulated. Their role was to be present, to occupy the German tank commander's attention, to give the Firefly the fraction of a second of distraction that made the first shot possible. The system required trust in both directions. The standard Sherman crews had to accept that they were advancing toward positions where German armor might be present, without the gun to deal with that armor themselves, relying on a tank behind them that they could not always see. The Firefly crew had to accept that the standard Sherman's movement would create the conditions for the shot, that the choreography would work as intended, that the German tank commander would be looking forward rather than scanning the ridgeline where the Firefly was waiting. When it worked cleanly. When it did not work, when the German tank identified the Firefly first, or when the Firefly's position was compromised before the engagement began, the consequences fell on the most valuable vehicle in the troop. The troop commanders who made the system work were men who understood its requirements precisely. The Firefly commander needed to know at every moment of an advance where the other three tanks were and what they were doing. He needed to position himself in relation to their movement, far enough back to be concealed, close enough to engage whatever revealed itself in front of them. He needed to read the terrain for hull-down positions before the advance began, identify them as the troop moved, and occupy them quickly enough that the Firefly was in position before the engagement arrived, rather than scrambling into position after it had already started. This was not a passive role. It required a constant active calculation of distance, of angles, of what the terrain ahead would offer and what it would deny. A Firefly commander who simply followed the standard Shermans and stopped when they stopped was not using the system. He was placing his tank where the Germans expected to find it, at the distance where they had aimed their first shot. The standard Sherman commanders, for their part, needed to accept a role that felt, in the short term, more exposed than comfortable. They were moving toward ground they had not cleared, with a gun that was adequate for most of what they would encounter and inadequate for the specific threat that made Normandy's armored fighting dangerous. The Firefly behind them was the answer to the specific threat, but it was behind them, not alongside them, not ahead of them, but in a position where its presence was useful precisely because it was not visible to whatever was waiting ahead. The trust this required was not automatic. It was built in the weeks of fighting through June and July, as the pattern repeated enough times that its logic became legible to the men executing it. The standard Sherman crews learned that the Firefly's shot, when it came early, before the German tank had fully committed to its engagement, before it had fired its own gun at the Shermans that had drawn its attention. The Firefly crews learned that the standard Sherman's advance, however uncomfortable it looked from behind, was creating conditions that the hull-down position and the waiting gun could exploit. The system had a name in some units, the 4-tank troop working as one, and no name in others, where it was simply what you did because it was what worked. By August 1944, as the Allied breakout from Normandy accelerated and the fighting moved from the close bocage country into the more open terrain of the interior, the tactic evolved. The open country changed the engagement distances. Fireflies were firing at ranges of 1,200 and 1,500 yards, distances at which the 17-pounder's velocity advantage over the German guns was even more pronounced. The longer ranges also made concealment easier. A hull-down Firefly on a distant ridgeline was harder to identify than one in the Norman hedgerows where everything was close. German armored units, retreating through France under Allied air attack and fuel shortages, were no longer able to fight the careful positional battles that had made Caen's defense so costly for British armor. The Panthers and Tigers that had been a fixed threat in static positions were now moving, often in small groups, fighting rearguard actions that gave their commanders less time to identify and engage Fireflies before the Fireflies engaged them. The exchange rates shifted. The tactic that had been developed out of necessity, 3 standard Shermans and 1 Firefly, working together because the alternative was worse, had become, by the autumn of 1944, something more refined than necessity. It was a practice system, with crews who understood their roles and trusted the roles of the tanks alongside them, applied to conditions that were increasingly favorable to the system's strengths. The Firefly had not changed. The gun was the same gun, the turret, the same cramped turret, the muzzle blast still brilliant enough to blind the gunner if he forgot to blink. What had changed was the crew's understanding of how to use it, the accumulated knowledge of a summer's fighting, translated into instinct and habit, and the specific confidence that comes from having done something enough times to know how it ends. Not always well, but often enough. The Firefly's reputation among the men who fought in it was complicated in a way that straightforward assessments of the tank rarely capture. It was not a beloved vehicle. The crews who operated it, respected the gun above all, the specific quality of knowing that the round in the breech could do what the situation required. But the Firefly did not inspire the kind of affection that soldiers sometimes develop for equipment that fits them well. It was cramped. The loader's work was physically demanding in a space that had not been designed for the ammunition he was handling. The muzzle blast was violent enough to be startling even after months of familiarity. The absence of the co-driver's escape hatch was a fact that crews lived with rather than forgot. The gun's barrel, distinctive enough to draw German fire, made the tank simultaneously the most powerful and the most endangered vehicle in its troop. What the Firefly inspired, consistently and across the accounts of the men who served in it and alongside it, was something more useful than affection. It inspired confidence. Not confidence in the tank as a whole. The Firefly was too clearly a compromise for that, an improvised answer to a problem that a better designed vehicle might have solved more elegantly. The confidence was specific. Confidence that the engagement with a Panther or a Tiger, which had previously been a situation without a reliable solution, now had one. That the troop was not helpless when the long-barreled German tank appeared at the end of the lane. That the 17-pounder round in the breech could reach across the distance and do what needed to be done. Ken Tout described this quality precisely when he wrote about the Firefly's effect on the crews around it. The presence of the long-barreled Sherman changed the psychological arithmetic of the advance. The standard Sherman crews who moved forward, whose 75mm guns could not solve the problem of a Panther at 800 yards, moved forward differently, knowing that the Firefly was behind them. Not safely. Nothing in Normandy was safe, but with the specific knowledge that the threat they could not address themselves was being addressed by something in their troop that could. This was not a small thing. The summer of 1944 in Normandy was, for British and Commonwealth tank crews, a campaign conducted at the intersection of tactical disadvantage and operational necessity. The British and Canadian sectors faced more than 70% of the German armor deployed in Normandy, including the elite SS Panzer divisions that the German command had concentrated around Caen. The tanks available to meet that armor, the standard Sherman, the Cromwell, the Churchill, were outgunned by the vehicles they were asked to fight. The Firefly was the correction to that imbalance, present in insufficient numbers, imperfect in its design, but present. Montgomery understood this when he declared the Firefly the highest priority in British tank production before D-Day. The 144 crew members who had submitted their formal request in 1943 had understood it before Montgomery. They had understood it from inside the problem, from the specific personal knowledge of what it felt like to face a Panther with a gun that could not answer it. The Firefly answered it, not elegantly, not completely. The HE deficiency meant that the standard Shermans remained necessary, and the scarcity of Fireflies meant that every troop had only one. But the answer existed. It was present at the front by D-Day, and it changed what British armor could do in the campaign that followed. The Firefly's story ended before the war did. By early 1945, British armored units were transitioning to the Comet, a purpose-built cruiser tank carrying a gun derived from the 17-pounder, designed from the outset to contain it rather than improvised around it. The Comet had a proper turret, a proper crew of 5, a proper escape hatch where the co-driver sat. It was everything the Firefly had tried to be and couldn't quite become, because the Firefly had been built in months from a platform that was never meant to carry what it was asked to carry. Canadian units transitioned to the M4A2E8, the American Sherman with the 76mm gun and the HVFF suspension. The Americans had eventually produced their own answer to the firepower problem, later than the British and with a gun that was somewhat less capable than the 17-pounder, but installed in a turret designed for it, with a crew that had all its positions intact. Both transitions were quiet acknowledgments of what the Firefly had always been, a stopgap. The word carried no dishonor in the context of what the stopgap had done. The Firefly had been ready when the Comet was not. It had been present in Normandy when the Challenger was delayed and the Cromwell was undergunned, and the American 76mm was still being fitted to vehicles that had not yet crossed the Atlantic. It had given British armor the ability to engage German heavy tanks at the moment when that ability was most critically needed. Not in 1945, when the German armored force was a shadow of what it had been, but in the summer of 1944, when it was still a serious force fighting seriously for ground that mattered. After the war, a Firefly turret was shipped to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for evaluation. The Americans tested it on an M4A3 chassis and assessed the combination. They did not adopt it. The Americans had their own guns, their own solutions, their own institutional preferences that did not include mounting a British weapon on an American hull. The assessment was professional, and the conclusion was theirs to make. The war had already rendered its own verdict. In late 1945, at a testing facility in Britain, engineers fired a 17-pounder at a captured King Tiger, the heaviest German tank of the war, with armor that the Panthers designers would have recognized as their own work taken to its logical extreme. The 17-pounder, even with APDS ammunition, could not reliably penetrate the King Tiger's frontal armor. The gun that had been adequate for the campaign had reached the limit of what adequacy could provide. The Comet was already in service. The Centurion was coming. The Firefly was yesterday's answer to yesterday's problem, which was precisely what it had been designed to be, and precisely what it had been. The engineers who had built it had not been trying to build the finest tank of the war. They had been trying to build something that worked, in the time available, with the platform available, for the campaign that was coming in 6 months and would not wait for a better solution. They had succeeded. The crews who had fought in it, who had learned to blink at the moment of firing, who had painted their barrels and memorized their hull-down positions and trusted the standard Shermans moving ahead of them to create the conditions for the shot, had made the success real. Not by having the best tank, by understanding what the tank they had could do, and doing it. The 17-pounder round that a Firefly gunner sent across 800 yards of Norman farmland toward the frontal armor of a Panther was not fired from the finest tank in the Allied arsenal. It did not need to be. It needed to penetrate. It did.